All right, hey guys, it's Mr. Pum. This is chapter 18 in the hard copy textbook, but it'll be a different chapter in the PDF. But either way, this is civil liberties. So I have civil liberties and civil rights grouped together in one unit, although it's really broken down into two units. I just say that they're in the same unit because of how interconnected they are in terms of people's rights and the application of that. Before we get started in the screencast for the notes, it's very important that you guys, if you have not done so already, read through every single one of the court cases on the sequence and sources. Double check the supplemental videos if you guys have further questions, because in this screencast I'm going to talk about cases as if you guys already understand them, as if you guys have some type of previous knowledge. So, maybe if I get to a court case or I get to a reference where you're unfamiliar with, maybe you want to pause this and do that. The second thing is, make sure you guys have out a slice of paper with you so that way you guys can take a few notes on some of the court cases that we're going to be doing in this screencast. There's going to be a whole bunch of them. Most of them are on the sequence of sources, but some of them are not. And some of them are really important precedents that could pop up on the test, and more specifically, you can use on the AP test. So there's a little political cartoon here. It says, "I wonder what Edward Snowden thinks of the new surveillance law." And the guy next to him says, "Now we'll need a warrant to find out." And that just kind of references Edward Snowden, who exposed what the NSA, the National Security Agency, was doing in terms of mass gathering of people's phone conversations and things like that. And once that leaked out, that really changed how courts operated in terms of getting a warrant and things along those lines. So let's go ahead and get into it. So civil liberties, some questions here that I asked is, what are the basic freedoms of the Bill of Rights? And really, you think about what Thomas Jefferson wanted in the Bill of Rights in terms of freedoms that people could have, everything from freedom of speech to the 10th Amendment, which is reserved powers of the states. Some amendments are really applicable in terms of day-to-day, like your First Amendment or your Fourth Amendment. Some amendments are not as clear or don't really apply as much, and that would be like the Third Amendment, which states that you can't be forced to house government troops. And we'll actually talk about how that possibly has happened in the past 10, 15 years as well. Second question says, what is the difference between civil rights and civil liberties? I'll let you guys look that up and answer that on your own. That's also a question on the study guide. Number 3 says, why were Bill of Rights incorporated in the Constitution? Who gained the upper hand, federal or state government? And that's interesting because we know anti-federalists wanted that added into the Constitution. And the question is, who has the upper hand, federal or state government? I think it's important to understand that the Bill of Rights only applied to people at the federal level initially. And states didn't necessarily have to listen or follow in line with them. And that's going to change as we start getting into the early parts of the 20th century with cases that are going to do something called incorporation. Number 4 says, how have the Bill of Rights been viewed throughout our nation's history? What were the major turning points that changed the overall outlook? What major court cases illustrate this outlook? So that's something you can answer on your own, but I think more importantly, that's something that you're going to want to reflect on at the end of this screencast. If we were in class, I'd have you guys do a homework assignment, which would be find a Supreme Court of the United States case. That's what SCOTUS stands for, Supreme Court of the United States case, that is considered to be a turning point, and explain why. The second part would be discuss another Supreme Court case that illustrates selective incorporation. Now, there is something that you guys are going to be reading about incorporation, selective incorporation. So when we get to that point in the notes, make sure you guys go ahead and read that. That'll be available online. So if you guys are unfamiliar with what this is the Westboro Baptist Church. They are a small group from Kansas that was started by a man named Fred Phelps. And in his church, really, it preaches straight up hate. What they do is they initially went around, specifically after 9/11. There's about 60 or 70 members of the church, I think, maybe a little bit less now. And they would find when soldiers' funerals would be. And they would go protest these funerals. And they would say things like, God hates dead soldiers, or thank God for dead soldiers. And just say really, really terrible things to try and gain attention for themselves. They would also make a lot of comments that were homophobic that I'm not going to state. If you guys look up online, you'll be able to easily find that. But really just a hateful group. And the question became a man's son died in, I believe it was Afghanistan. It was Afghanistan or Iraq, and his last name was Snyder. And during his funeral, the Westboro Baptist Church, as you can see where they're holding up signs, went to the funeral. Now, they did not go on cemetery grounds, but as the procession was driving into the cemetery, they were holding up these signs, singing songs, saying really terrible things. And the father sued them, saying that their speech had caused him harm, and was suing them for money. Now, what you have to understand is that part of the Westboro Baptist Church, some of them are lawyers. So it's, I guess, fortunate for them, unfortunate for us, that they literally are the type of people that will go up to the line without necessarily crossing it. And in the court case Snyder versus Phelps, the question was whether or not someone's speech can be limited if it is offending someone else. And when you put it in that terms, it becomes kind of, an interesting conversation. I think, and I would hope that we would all agree that what the Westboro Baptist Church does is awful. But the question is, just because someone finds it hurtful, does that give them the right to limit their speech? And the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in favor of the Westboro Baptist Church, basically saying that their speech was not directed at a singular person. So it wasn't like, thank God, Snyder is dead and was a soldier. They kept it vague. They kept it as just, thank God for dead soldiers, or God hates, and insert the slur there, which they use. So because they kept it vague, the Supreme Court ruled that Mr. Snyder could not have offense to it where they could limit their speech. Now, if they were targeting him specifically, that could then change. And the Supreme Court's ruling on that was that they felt that if you set the precedent, meaning an example, that if someone's speech is offensive, that then that could literally then start to lessen people's freedom of speech based upon the level of people's willingness to say that bothers me or this bothers me. And we're going to be taking a look at that as to, speech, and just because someone finds it offensive doesn't mean that it can be stopped. And flag burning would be an example of that as well. So let's talk about culture and civil liberties. Really, the biggest thing is that we have rights in conflict. So think about that. You have rights, I have rights, and sometimes those rights are pitted against one another. So, if you think about the coronavirus and these people who are anti-maskers, who don't believe that wearing a mask helps, even though there is, a crazy amount of science to show that it prevents the spread. Just because someone doesn't want to wear a mask, can you force them to wear a mask? But then if you're occupying the same space and you're not wearing a mask and I am, and I feel unsafe, are my rights being violated? And, these situations pop up all the time. And I mean, that's just a general example. We're going to look at some really crazy examples of where these things come in conflict. But rights come in conflict with one another. And the question is, who's right? Who's wrong? And it's the Supreme Court's job to decide that from time to time. The second are cultural conflicts. Cultural diversity within the United States gives differing meanings to the Constitution. Really think about freedom of religion like this. There are different religions who have different beliefs and different acts. And sometimes when people practice their religions and you have people that are unfamiliar with them, things can come head to head and people feel that their rights are being violated or somebody else's. If you think about the sacrificing of animals, for instance, some cultures believe in the sacrificing animals for religious reasons. Well, other people might say, I don't want to witness that, or I don't want to see an animal be sacrificed, and they'll fight against that. So sometimes it has to be prescribed when you can practice your rights, whether that's a protest or whether that's literally the sacrificing animals. There are prescriptions to where that can be done and how that can be done without your rights being violated. Another thing is applying the Bill of Rights to the states. Now, this is where you guys should stop and read the incorporation handout. Incorporation is basically where it's the process where the Supreme Court gets a case that deals with an amendment and basically says that that amendment not only applies to somebody at the federal level, but also the state level. And this is kind of tough to understand initially. So in order for an amendment to be incorporated, there has to be a court case, and the Supreme Court has to take that case, and the Supreme Court has to rule and specifically say that that amendment applies to you at the federal level and the state level. So let's get into what incorporation means and something called selective incorporation, but understand that all this deals with the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So let's get into some rights in conflict. We'll get back to incorporation. So here are some examples of rights in conflict from the previous slide. So there was a court case called Shepard versus Maxwell. So the question was Shepard's right to a fair trial versus a reporter's rights to free speech. So it was in Ohio. Shepard was being charged with murder, and Maxwell was a reporter. So apparently the reporter got a bunch of information about the case and was putting this out in the newspaper. Okay, so that's Maxwell's First Amendment free press. Okay, Shepard was unhappy with this because everybody was reading about the crime before his court case. So you are entitled to have a trial in front of your peers, meaning jurors. So he was afraid that his jury pool, meaning the people that are selected for the jury, would already have a predisposed idea of his guilt, opposed to him having a free trial. Because, let's say I get arrested for robbing a bank, they're going to pull jurors from the local area. They're not going to pull jurors from Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. Typically it's in the area. So if Maxwell's printing something about him, people are going to understand this. So who's right and who's wrong? I mean, Maxwell has the right to free press, but Shepard also has the right to a fair trial. That's in the Bill of Rights. So what they ended up deciding was, the Supreme Court, that you could not stop Maxwell from printing that information, but Shepard had a right to a free trial. So what they ended up doing was doing something called a change of venue, where they changed where his court case would take place and where the jurors would be pulled from, so that way they would not have a familiarity with the case. Now, if you think about Bill Cosby or Jerry Sandusky, the man who was convicted of child molestation at Penn State, Jerry Sandusky asked for a change of venue because he felt that his trial was going to be unfair. And the courts actually ruled against him because he said, because of his celebrity status, which is even sick to say, but because people knew who he was because of Penn State football, that no matter where he went in the state of Pennsylvania, people would already be familiar with that case. So sometimes a change of venue is impossible if it's a really famous crime. I mean, think about like the O.J. Simpson crime or other cases that have national attention. So New York Times versus the United States. This is the United States government's duty to provide for the common defense versus freedom of press. So this dealt with the Pentagon Papers, whether or not the New York Times was going to be able to print information that was classified. Now, I know there's a lot of questions about the news today. People say fake news, this, that, the other thing. Reputable, as I stutter here, reputable news outlets will talk to the Department of Defense, will talk to the Pentagon about information before they publish it. So let's say the New York Times has something that deals with troop movement or has something about the location of a terrorist. They will go to the Department of Defense. And now these are reputable news outlets. I'm not talking about like a blog or some Joe Schmo on Twitter. They'll go to the government and basically say, if we print this, will people be in danger? Is there something you're doing? And sometimes the Department of Defense or the Pentagon will ask them to hold off on it. Sometimes the New York Times or other publications will willingly kill the article, but sometimes they will print it anyway. And this is the case where they printed the Pentagon Papers anyway because it did not pose, and star this, a clear and present danger, meaning them printing it did not mean somebody would be in danger at this moment in time. There was not a clear and present danger. So you cannot prevent somebody from publishing something, even if it's classified, if there's not a clear and present danger. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get sued afterwards. And that deals with something called prior restraint, which I'll get into a little later. But basically, this gave media outlets a lot more leeway in their ability to print information and to some extent, hold government accountable. The court case Kunz versus New York. Kunz was a freedom of speech, religious speech, in fact, versus New York Police Department's duty to preserve order. So essentially what happened was this guy was on the streets and he was, I don't want to say spewing, but saying all kinds of hateful stuff and tying it into religion. And the New York Police Department was trying to shut him down and prevent him from speaking, but wasn't doing the same with other groups of people who are religious. So basically what they're saying is, in this court case, is that you do have the ability to restrict someone's speech, but it has to be equal. So if you're going to stop this guy from saying his speech, you then have to stop other people in the same manner, or you have to allow both. We see this today with protests. So recently with the Black Lives Matter protests, you're allowed to protest, but what you're not allowed to do is stop traffic. You're not allowed to prevent people from going on their daily lives. Many times if you want to protest, whether it was like the Women's March in D.C. or some other protests we saw like in Charlottesville, which had an unfortunate ending, a lot of times people get permits and you have to get a permit. So in Charlottesville, for instance, you had people on one side who were upset with racial issues, who had a permit, and then you had white supremacists on the other side who also had a permit. So if you're going to give those protesting for racial justice a permit, you can't say, well, we're not going to give the white supremacists a permit because we don't like your ideas. That's not how the Bill of Rights works. If you're going to give one, you have to give the other. Now, you can put limits on it, and you can tell them where to go. After Charlottesville, a young lady was ran over by a car and passed away. And then there was going to be another type of protest in Boston, Massachusetts. And what Boston did was they put the white supremacists on one end of town and put the other protests on the other end of town. And if people left those areas of protest and were going to protest, they then could be arrested. So their rights were not going to be violated then because it was very prescribed as to where their speech was and how it could be restricted. The underlying people all won in court, which I basically went over with each case. So rights in conflict continued. Star of this word, policy entrepreneur. These are people who find ways of pulling together a legislative majority on behalf of unorganized interests, things like civil rights, climate change. So basically what this means is that this is somebody who's able to get people on board with something even though they might not really care about it. So let's say it's something like clean water. Clean water, I think, or hope that we would all be interested in, but really not everybody is. So you might have a policy entrepreneur, and this could be like a person that's like literally an entrepreneur, or it could be a member of Congress who is getting people who are, let's say, environmentalists in Congress. And then you could also maybe get people that are in the private sector that would benefit from clean water. Maybe it's their neighborhood, maybe it's the fact that they're a bottling corporation, but you pull people together that otherwise would not have gotten together on something. And we're going to talk about policy entrepreneurs throughout the rest of the year. And really our next unit, we'll talk about it with affirmative action in a court case called Fisher versus the University of Texas. Entrepreneurial politics are policies benefiting society as a whole that impose a substantial cost on a small segment of society. So what that means is there might be like restrictions on something. So let's say that you have cattle ranchers in the Midwest, and they're on federal lands, and because of the methane that the cattle's producing, and the fact that they're eating up all the crops, that's affecting some type of wildlife or maybe even the water sources. So the United States might put impose on them where the cattle can go. That is putting a substantial cost on those small cattle herders because of the fact that they might have to go somewhere else or now pay for feed but it's benefiting society as a whole because now there's cleaner water and open spaces in an area. Another example of this would be we will talk about pipelines and something called eminent domain. Now, eminent domain is a part of the Fifth Amendment, and that's going to be a key part of the court case Kelo versus New London, which is on the sequence and sources. Eminent domain is basically where the national government or state government really can claim your land if it's for public use or public benefit. Now, they still have to give you money for it. But let's say that there are a row of homes. So let's think about Emmaus High School. Think about the houses right across the street from Emmaus High School. Actually, no, this is a really bad example. Let's talk about a pipe. Let's think about a natural gas pipeline. So natural gas pipelines run underground, and it's a cheap, effective way to provide energy to millions of people. The problem is when they want to expand those pipelines, people's houses are sometimes in the way. So what the government will do is force those people out of their homes, whether they want to leave or not. Now, there's a standard of time that they get everything else, and they get market value for their homes. And that is the cost, the small people that are paying a cost for a pipeline that is going to benefit a large group of people. So it could be anything from like a dam, a pipeline, or whatever else, where you have policies benefiting the whole society but impose a substantial cost on a small amount of people. Sorry about that. I really went off of a bit of a tangent there. So acts of Congress restricting civil liberties. I'll let you guys read through these on your own. They also pop up in the book. Culture conflict examples. Where culture comes in conflict, religious displays on public property. The United States does not have a national religion. Sometimes that's tough to differentiate from because obviously Christianity plays a large part, and a large part meaning most people in government tend to lean towards Christianity. But the birth of Christ in the manger has been removed from some public areas. And how some cities have gone around it is where they allow any religious displays that would like to post something there during their holiday. So, you might have the Star of David, you have the birth of Christ in the manger, they have things for Kwanzaa, so they are respecting all religions' chance to display. So you can get around that by allowing everything. But if you just allow one, then you could get in trouble because of public property. In fact, in Alabama, they used to have the 10 Commandments at a courthouse, and they were forced to remove that because of its tying in with religion. People got very upset about that, but religion has no place in government. Second part here is bilingual education constitutionally required. English is taught. Why not Spanish? Think about that. So in all schools, you have some type of language arts. People teach English, grammatics of that. Why? Because English is predominantly the language of the United States. However, we do not have an official language. So some people will say, well, why isn't Spanish taught at a full length like English? And that has never really been specifically challenged to prevent, but what we do see here is kids have the opportunity to take many languages. So at Emmaus, you guys can take Latin, you can take Spanish, you can take German, you can take French. And I know some schools even have like Mandarin, Italian, and some other things. But these are questions people will ask. And again, I'm bringing up these things to show you culture and conflict. I'm not taking one side or another. I'm just showing you the viewpoints. The third point here, may private associations make their own rules concerning the right to associate freely, quote unquote, meaning can a private organization prevent somebody from joining that organization? For instance, the Boy Scouts refused homosexuals for a very long time. We're going to talk about that, Boy Scouts of America versus Dale. Gender in sports, how does that work? And really one of the key components to this is, and we'll talk about this in civil rights, is that if you receive any type of federal funding, you may not discriminate. And we see that with genders and sports. And I don't want to get too much into that now because I'm going to have a big discussion about that with Title IX and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and some other ones after that in civil rights. So the big thing is balancing community sensitivities with personal self-expression. That's really the I guess the teetering that has to be done by government, is that you want people to be able to express themselves, but do it in a way where it doesn't make anybody too upset, and keeping people's sensitivities in mind. So here are some cultural conflicts continued. Here's a Hispanic girl who studies both English and Spanish in a bilingual classroom. In fact, the Southern Lehigh School District, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to, where you could actually opt in and your entire year would be taught in Spanish. So a lot of people did that because they like the fact that their kids would become bilingual by the time they reached middle school. And really, the younger you are, the easier it is for your brain to understand. It's more malleable in terms of understanding other languages. But I admire people that know many languages. I do not, unfortunately. Here's another one. This was the Masterpiece Bake Shop. This was in Colorado, where the man at the bottom refused to bake a cake for a homosexual couple because he said it was against his freedom of religion. And here you have rights in conflict. Does somebody have the right to have a cake made? And does he have the right to say that I'm not going to make it for you because it's against my religion? And essentially what the Supreme Court got this case, and the Supreme Court will do this, they ended up not making a decision on it. They just send it back to the lower court because they didn't want to set a precedent quite yet. And I guess the cake baker offered to bake a cake, but he wasn't willing to do, I forget if it was 2 women or 2 men, but he wasn't willing to put that on there. He wasn't willing to say anything about a wedding. So the question is, so the gay couple actually went to his bake shop. He said no, and then they took him to court on purpose because they wanted a decision on this. And that, to some extent, is also entrepreneurial politics, where you see that there is possibly an area that you want changed in society. So then you I shouldn't say exasperate, but you attack that to get a court case. And believe it or not, it's not illegal. In some situations, people have created fictitious situations to get the cops to come to a call or whatever else to then get a court case decision. So although this wasn't a fictitious situation, they knew he wasn't going to bake the cake and went there anyway to try and force his hand to set a precedent for the nation. And the Supreme Court just wasn't willing to make a decision on that yet. All right, so now we get into incorporation, which we talked about earlier. So the 14th Amendment I mentioned in our last unit is probably the I shouldn't say the most important, but one of the most important amendments in the Constitution because of its ability to consistently influence. And when it was written, it was really just that, people couldn't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Basically, it was a way to give slaves rights. But over the course of time, the 14th Amendment has been used to provide people with, and here are the big parts of it, you can see the underline, to make sure people are given due process of law and equal protection of the laws. So the 14th Amendment is now being used to provide people of different religions equal protection, different sexualities, people of different races equal protection. So the Equal Protection Clause has really changed over the course of our history with the Supreme Court's interpretation. And understand that the Supreme Court, when they make a decision, it can be overturned later on, like Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed segregation. Brown versus Board of Education will end segregation to some extent. But the equal protection of the laws, the Supreme Court has changed their viewpoint on that to apply that now to everybody. And that's really important because they use the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to say you have the First Amendment under federal law, you also have it in state law. So let me give you a good example of that. So in the 1980s, there was a guy Oh, geez, I'm forgetting his first name. His last name was Gregory Johnson was his name. This became the court case Texas versus Johnson, which you'll read in sequence of sources. So Gregory Johnson burned an American flag in protest. Now, there was a bunch of background to it. He actually stole the flag, but he burned the flag, okay? And he got arrested and was put in jail because under Texas state law, you were not allowed to burn the flag. So he took that to court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of him, saying that flag burning is a form of speech. And due to the Equal Protection Clause, he had the right to freedom of speech not only on federal lands, but also in the state of Texas on state property and on his own private property. Okay, so understand that. The Equal Protection Clause is used to, quote unquote, incorporate amendments. And by incorporate, I mean apply an amendment not just to the federal government, but also to the states. Think about this. The right to own a weapon, Second Amendment, was not incorporated until 2010. So that means states, theoretically, could have prevented you from buying or owning a weapon up until that point. And Washington, D.C. tried, and then it immediately went to court, okay? The slaughterhouse cases, which you guys will read about, had a narrow interpretation initially, the 14th Amendment. They actually said that the Equal Protection Clause only applies to the federal government, and that goes with what I was just saying, how the interpretation has changed over time. But then after the slaughterhouse cases, and once we start getting into the 20th century, the 1900s, the Supreme Court, as justices changed, started to realize that no, the Equal Protection Clause is a way for us to provide people with rights that they have at the federal level, but also the state level, and essentially create an equilibrium where just because you go from one state to another state, your rights aren't going to change. You're granted certain rights under the Constitution no matter where you live. This changes in 1925 with what case? I say clear and present danger and danger tendency case. So let's go ahead and talk about that. Make sure you know which court case had clear and present danger and which court case talked about a danger tendency. So let's talk about incorporation. Interpreting and applying the First Amendment. So the restrictions on expression handout. At this point in time, you guys should read the obscenity handout as to how speech that's not even a word, how speech can be prevented if it's seen as obscene. So your rights of expression can be limited, okay? You have a freedom of expression, you have freedom of religion, but there are ways that your speech can be stopped. For instance, speech and national security. In the court case of Gitlow versus New York, Gitlow versus the United States, someone's speech can be limited if it is going to create and impose an issue on national security. So the guy Gitlow was actually telling people to not sign up for the draft, not go to the draft. And what ended up happening there was that if you had everybody, he was trying to get people to overthrow the government. And if you had people actually go to overthrow the government, that could create a national security issue. So your speech can be limited. There was a guy online who was trying to share with people how to print guns using a 3D printer. And the Supreme Court stopped him from doing that. And he tried to claim that his speech was being limited. His speech wasn't being limited because that could get in the hands of criminals or kids who aren't allowed to have guns, and therefore that could create a security issue. There is something called prior restraint. Prior restraint is where the court can decide to prevent something from being printed or said before it's said. So a good example of this would be the book recently written by former security advisor John Bolton, and the book recently printed and published by Donald Trump's niece, Mary Trump. The Trump administration tried to prevent both of those books from coming out because they didn't like what they said. With John Bolton, they said that there was national security issues, and with Mary Trump, they said that she defied a non-disclosure agreement, basically saying that she wouldn't talk about something and got paid to do that. The Supreme Court, actually lower federal courts, in both cases decided that they would not stop the publication of the book. And here's why. To stop somebody's speech takes a high burden of proof. And basically what they said was, if John Bolton put things in that book that, affects national security, then after it's published, you can sue John Bolton. Mary Trump, if she puts things in that book about Donald Trump and the family that she agreed not to publish, we can't stop her from publishing the book. However, once that book's out, you can then sue her for publishing that. So prior restraint is where you basically try and prevent somebody from doing something before it actually happens. And the Supreme Court and federal court very rarely gets involved with that. Clear and present danger test. This is basically when speech can be prevented. And take a look at the court cases, Schenck versus the U.S. and Gitlow versus New York. Those are two very important cases. They are in the sequence and sources. But sometimes the Supreme Court will create something called a test. And this is because not all situations are the same. And you might have a situation about speech in one scenario, and that scenario would be very different in something else. And you're not sure if the precedent in one court case can apply to the next. So the Supreme Court, realizing this, will sometimes create a list or a test so that way future courts or cops in future generations or lawyers or whoever else can look at that test and see if it passes. For instance, the clear and present danger test was basically that speech can only be prevented if it creates a clear and present danger at the time. So if you go into a movie theater and yell fire, your speech can be limited. You can get in trouble for that because that creates a clear and present danger. You are causing chaos, possibly a catastrophe. That's clear and present danger. However, if you're saying that, the Trump administration needs to end because they're going to do this, this, and this, and you're saying possible threats, but it doesn't create a clear and present danger, your speech can't necessarily be prevented. It has to show without question that there is a clear and present danger with what you are saying or doing. All right, so we keep talking about this incorporation. Let's talk about what it actually, what cases actually happens with it. So landmark cases, Gitlow versus New York. This was the first time, the first time that the Supreme Court incorporated an amendment. 1925. The Supreme Court said the First Amendment applies to the states. That's why Gregory Johnson, when he got that flag and burned it, and Texas told him he could not, the Supreme Court was able to overrule that because the First Amendment in 1925 was incorporated, meaning it applied to the states, and Texas could not prevent someone's speech. Okay? Now, if you take a look at the bottom, 2010, the Second Amendment was incorporated in 2010. So you might say, well, hold on. So we went through like 200 years of our country's history with states having the ability to prevent you from buying a gun? And the answer is yeah, because there was no situation that ever happened that a state actually prevented somebody from buying a gun. So there was no need for the Supreme Court to incorporate it. Understand that. The Supreme Court is only going to incorporate an amendment, meaning apply it at the federal level and also to the state level if a situation arises. And that situation did arise with a court case called D.C. versus Heller, where the Washington, D.C. Actually outlawed you from buying or owning a weapon in and on D.C. property. And a man named Heller tried that, and then eventually this rolled into another court case that dealt with McDonald versus Chicago, where city of Chicago tried to prevent people from selling and buying weapons in the area of Chicago. And the Supreme Court took on that case and basically said that the Second Amendment applies to people not only just at the federal level, but also at the state level. So Chicago could not prevent you from buying and owning a weapon. Now, there is some leeway there as to what types of weapons and what type of background checks. New Jersey has very stringent background checks. In fact, they force you to have a waiting period. You have to write a letter. You have to do all these things. In Pennsylvania, if you want a gun, 18 for a non-concealable weapon like a rifle, 21 for a concealed weapon. and you can just basically go in and get a background check, and leave and be out within 15 minutes. Okay. Gay marriage we'll talk about with the court case Oberfigel versus Hodges. We'll talk about that a little later. All right, so let's talk about what is speech. Forms of speech not automatically given constitutional protection, meaning it wasn't automatically right away. Libel and slander. Libel is the written word. Slander is the spoken word. Those are not protected by the First Amendment. So I can't slander you. I can't publicly say harmful things about you. Like, now the question is, what's a harmful thing? If I say that you're a mean person, you could say, well, you're slandering me. Well, there's not a clear and present danger with that. If I'm spreading lies that actually affect you or hurt you, or workplace, things like that, you can sue me. Libel being the same thing, but it's just the written word. Melania Trump, after Donald Trump won the presidency, I forget what magazine it was, but somebody printed an article basically saying that she was a high-end escort before becoming Donald Trump's wife. And she sued them and won because it was obviously false. And she won a bunch of money, as she should have, because it was obviously false. You can only get in trouble with libel if you publish something that you know is false. Okay, so that's that you knew it was false and you did it anyway to hurt somebody. Obscenity is not protected. Obscenity is in the reading. Please take a look at that. Symbolic speech. Symbolic speech was not automatically protected, but most of it is protected now. If you take a look at things like flag burning, burning of draft cards was not protected initially. That was granted amnesty later on. And the other thing not protected is false advertising. So that's somewhere, it's not liable, but it's similar, where you're knowingly publishing something that's false in order to get sales. That's not protected either. Here's an example of symbolic speech. I'll let you guys read that on your own. All right, applying the Bill of Rights to the states and corporation. The Second Amendment we talked about being applied through McDonald versus Chicago. That is in the sequencing sources. Make sure you read that. Let's talk about church and state. The Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Now, make sure you guys know that there are 5 parts to the First Amendment, okay? You have speech, religion, press, petition, and what's the last one? I'll let you guys look it up. But another part of of this is the Establishment Clause, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And believe it or not, the founding fathers were very concerned that religion would be tied into government, because they saw that in Great Britain with first the Catholics, and then the not Protestants, but under the Church of England, and issues with Puritans and others. So they had a real resentment for when religion was being used as a way of the formulation of laws. And then if you think about that, like after some time, the country kind of got away from that. And although we don't have an established religion plays a large part. But understand that there is an establishment clause, and we'll talk about court cases that have reiterated that. Courts have ruled about something called the wall of separation theory, STAR that. That's not in the Constitution, but it's basically what the Supreme Court has written about, basically saying that the court has ruled that the government cannot be involved with religion. And we see the government involved with religion, and there are levels of it that it can, but there are also areas that it can't. So let's go over some examples. Some landmark cases. Angle versus Vitale, 1962, says there may not be prayer, even non-denominational prayer, in public schools. If there's a group of kids who want to start a club about religion, let's say a Christianity club, then you have a group starting a Jewish club, a Muslim club, whatever, the schools are allowed to allow those clubs, but they can't prevent one religion or another, and they also can't promote it. If you think about the national anthem, or let's think about the national anthem at football games, okay? After the national anthem, a lot of times there is a moment of silence. It's a moment of silence because it's allowing people on their own to pray or not pray. In a public school, in a public stadium like Emmaus's football field, they cannot get over the loudspeaker and say a prayer. That would be a violation. If you guys have ever, though, gone to like Becca or Central Catholic in Allentown and gone to a basketball game, there is prayer there. And that's because that is not a public school. So even though the Emmaus, girls and boys basketball teams go there to play, you're on their ground, that's allowed to happen. But the reverse is not true. When they play at Emmaus's field or court, there's not going to be a prayer over the loudspeaker. Lemon versus Kurtzman, 1971, said that there are 3 tests to describe for whether or not government is improperly involved with religion. So let's get into those 3 tests. Number 1, does the law have a secular purpose? Meaning, is the purpose of the law non-religious? So if the purpose of the law is non-religious, but accidentally maybe helps or hurts a religion or seems to promote a religion, then it might pass the test. But let's go on to the second one. Is the primary effect either to advance or inhibit religion? So if you have a law that is trying to advance one religion over another, let's say you want to give tax breaks to Christian churches, but not, mosques, then that would be seen as inhibiting mosques and Muslims and helping Christians. That can't happen. If you're going to give a tax break, to nonprofits like churches, then it has to be churches of all religions or all praying places. The third part is, does the law foster an excessive governmental entanglement with religion? Okay, so let's look at an example here with this. Any money given to religious schools promotes religion because they are religious first and foremost. You can't guarantee religion would never invade instruction and would be too difficult to monitor, and that would be excessive entanglement. So let me go over this. The government can't give money to Catholic schools or Jewish day schools or whatever else. So if you're saying, well, they're just giving it to the school, to help them build because it's an important part of the city, at the end of the day, they are praying there. And even though you're saying that it doesn't have a secular purpose, the issue is that it's an excessive entanglement. Now, this year, the Supreme Court actually ruled that if a child decides to go to a private school instead of a public school, that it is possible that the amount of money that would have went to their school in taxes can actually be transferred to that private school. And a lot of people felt that is going to hurt public schools and enhance private schools. So let me explain that a bit further. If you decide to go to a charter school, let's say you drop out of Emmaus and you go to like a cyber school, Emmaus has what's called a per pupil rate, meaning how much it costs them for every student to be at the high school. If you go to a charter school, the East Penn School District has to give whatever charter school you go to your per pupil rate because your charter school doesn't get tax money. That was allowed for non-religious charter schools. But now what the Supreme Court says is if you go to a Catholic school, Jewish day school, a Muslim school, whatever, that your tax dollars could be transferred as well. And basically what they were trying to just say is that it's equal. They felt that the law was hurting and specifically pointing out that religious schools couldn't get any money. So I'll let you guys decide whether or not you think that's a government entanglement. Another thing is busing. If let's say you transfer to Central, and you live in the East Penn School District, the East Penn School District has to pay for your busing to private schools, whether it's an art school or a Catholic school. And the purpose of that is it's a secular purpose, okay? Or it's not. It does not have anything to do with religion. The fact that you're getting a bus ride to school, they want to make sure it's safe. There is no primary. If you take a look at it's not advancing or inhibiting a religion. It's not enhancing by saying we're only giving kids busing to Catholic schools or this. They're giving busing to any schools. And it does not foster an excessive government entanglement because you're not learning, a religion on the school bus. So believe it or not, the East Penn School District and many other school districts, well, all school districts, pay for kids busing to their private schools. All right, let's talk about crime and due process. Something called the exclusionary rule. This is where things found during a search can be excluded if they are found to have happened without good faith. So the exclusionary rule basically means that all evidence found basically in a search that did not have a warrant or was not in good faith is what's called inadmissible in court. So there was a court case called Mapp versus Ohio. The police in Ohio, it was in Cleveland, went into this woman's house with a fake warrant, because they were searching for a bombing suspect, and he was not in her house. But while they were in her house, they found different forms of pornography, which in the 60s was illegal in Ohio, I guess. So they arrested her for that and brought her in. And the Supreme Court totally dodged the question of pornography in Ohio, but basically said, you can't arrest this woman for finding something that you found with a fake warrant when you were looking for something else. Okay, so searches have to be done in good faith, and they have to be done using a search warrant or what we call, probable cause, reasonable suspicion, those types of things. Make sure you guys read the Fourth Amendment. So you need probable cause really to pull someone over and really get to the level what's called reasonable suspicion to search them, but most times cops will get a warrant for that. There is something called the good faith exemption, and this is where officers, if they're acting in what's called quote-unquote good faith, and they find something even though they did not intend to, it's allowed to be used in court. So I'll give an example of this. There was a court case, and I'm forgetting the name of the court case, but the cops got a warrant from a judge to go search this guy's house. So they went through the proper protocol. They searched the guy's house and they found all this marijuana, right? And later on, once the guy was arrested, his lawyer was challenging the validity of the warrant, basically saying that the judge gave the warrant without enough burden of proof. Basically, they didn't have reasonable suspicion. And the court agreed that, the judge really should not have given the warrant. However, the officers conducting the search had a legal warrant. And since they had a legal warrant, they're allowed to use what they found in that guy's house against him in the court of law because it was a quote-unquote good faith search. Good faith is also going to come into play when you guys take a look at the court case New Jersey versus TLO. Now, if somebody searches, this is why cops really take their time and detectives before they search someone's house. Because they don't want a cop or whatever, they don't want a person getting off on something because there was recklessness in the search and that there was not enough cause to conduct a search. So let me give you another example of this. Let's say that, I'm driving down the street and I get pulled over. So let's say the cop pulled me over because I was leaving a music festival. It was 1 o'clock in the morning and my tire hit the yellow line. Okay, so the cop has enough cause or reasonable suspicion to pull me over, right? So he pulls me over and he has the right to do that. Now, while talking to me, he realizes that I'm not under the influence. Nothing is wrong. Maybe my hand just tilted the steering wheel a little bit and my tire touched the yellow line. If that cop decides to pull me out of my car and just search my car and finds, let's say, 10 kilos of cocaine, I could fight that in court that the cop did not have probable cause to go through my car. He had enough suspicion to pull me over, okay? But I wasn't under the influence. There was nothing in plain view sight in my car. He just decided to conduct a search on his own. That is not enough probable cause for a search. So I would, in that case, actually get off on that charge. Now, obviously, the cocaine would not be given back. That would be destroyed. But there are situations where people have been arrested, and because there was not enough probable cause for the search to be conducted, that the people got essentially away with it. Now, what can happen and what will happen is cops, if they have a suspicion, will sometimes bring out a canine dog or other things, or impound a car and wait for a warrant. The latter example are obviously very few and far between. Confessions and self-incrimination. You have the right to remain silent. That's all brought to you by a court case called Miranda versus Arizona, which you guys have to read. Please take a look at that. Ernesto Miranda was arrested on raping a woman. They had all the evidence in the world, got a confession, but then they found out that essentially he was not provided his rights. So today, cops will, and they use this term, Miranda you, if they're seeking what's called guilt-seeking questions. So cops do not need to read you your Miranda rights if they're just asking you general questions like, hey, what's your name? You have to respond to them. You can't stay quiet. But if they're asking you questions like, did you do this? Did you do that? They have to Mirandize you so that way you understand what your rights are. Relaxing the exclusionary rule, police fishing. There has been a relaxing of the exclusionary rule in times, especially since the Patriot Act and with terrorism. Terrorism and civil liberties have had a really come head to head. People are willing. Most polls show a lot of people are willing to give up their not their civil liberties in general, but some of them for national security. The Patriot Act, which was passed in bipartisan support after 2001, after September 11th, really restricted a lot of people's civil liberties in terms of if you're thought to be a terrorist, the way that they could treat you, the way that they could hold you for extended periods of time without reading you your rights. All those things came to play and really have relaxed the exclusionary rule with that. In fact, this has come to light with the Trump administration because he had criticized the FISA court, but cops need to go to a judge to get a warrant, right? And the judge is the one who basically decides whether or not there's enough probable cause to allow a warrant to happen. Since 1972 in the Cold War, our national government created this series of courts called FISA courts. And what FISA courts are, it's where the national government can go and apply for search warrants in secrecy. And most times warrants, although you might not know about them, they're public. They become public. And there's a lot of suspicion around FISA courts and issues with FISA warrants. And we'll talk about that a little later on, and we'll talk about that in class. Section 702 is the most controversial part. Feel free to go to that YouTube link and watch what that is. But basically what Section 702 is of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is where the government can collect mass data on you without any type of probable cause. So this is where, let's say, the United States government is looking for a terrorist. Now, none of your amendments apply to you. No amendments apply if you're not an American citizen, and it's questionable whether or not they apply to you if you're overseas. But the federal government was collecting mass data, meaning like all the phone calls that a terrorist would receive, and then they would record all of those phone conversations that people would have. And people were getting upset that their phone conversations were essentially being recorded without their consent. But there's a whole series of what they call blacklisting and masking and things along those lines. So take a look at that YouTube video, and then we'll talk about that in class. intelligence agencies snooping, that dealt with the mass data collection I was talking about. And here's a question for you guys that has come up of recent, because I think it was the University of Colorado created a drug sensing capability where they could actually put something on the front of a car, and if that car drove around a neighborhood, they could actually sense, not the cops, but this machine, which buildings or which areas had drugs inside of them. And the question is, does that violate your Fourth Amendment? Should the police be able to just drive around a town and see who has, drugs and who doesn't? The next question is like heat lamps or electricity bills. Does the government have the right to access people's electricity bills to see maybe where there are grow houses? And those are questions that we can talk about in class as well. Guantanamo Bay. This is where terrorists are kept and were kept. The Obama administration promised to get rid of it. They did not. And this really goes to the fact of people's rights possibly being violated if they are a terrorist. Landmark Supreme Court cases to take a look at. I'll let you guys read these on your own. A big important one from 2004 was Rasul versus Bush and Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, basically talking about terrorist detainees must have access to a neutral court to decide if they're legally held, meaning terrorists are allowed to be held for an extended period of time, but there has to be an independent court that decides whether or not them being held there violates their rights as well. All right. So that ends here. I honestly, I've gone through a lot of this information quite quickly because a lot of this information is going to be discussed in class or online. The big thing is that you guys read through the court cases on the sequence and sources, and that you guys are familiar with each amendment in the Bill of Rights. All of them are going to pop up on the test, one form or another. Also, make sure you understand what incorporation is. Read that incorporation document. Make sure you know which amendments are fully incorporated and which ones are not incorporated at all. Okay?